I'm James Walker, 62, and the HOA fined me $500 and kicked me out of the neighborhood gala for wearing my army dress blues. The shame didn't come quietly. It came with a room full of turned heads, half-filled glasses of Chardonnay, and Karen's nasal voice echoing through the Oak Glen clubhouse like she was declaring war. "This isn't Arlington," she said, looking me up and down like I dragged dirt across her pristine floors. "This is a social event, not a military parade. You're scaring the children." I had stood in deserts where the wind stung like grit and watched the sun rise over base camps I didn't know I'd leave alive. I had stared down men who wanted me dead and walked away with medals I never asked for. But somehow this moment being humiliated in front of my neighbors for wearing the uniform I spent 30 years earning felt like a deeper cut. I didn't say a word, just nodded, turned, and left. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I could still hear the muffled music and laughter from inside, but none of it touched me. My chest felt tight, not from anger, from something older, like a slow-burning shame that didn't belong to me but had been dumped on me anyway. Later, I found out Karen had emailed the HOA board the week before suggesting we discourage overt displays of nationalism that might make neighbors feel unsafe. Apparently, that included a retired Army officer quietly standing near the punch table. I wish I could say that moment was an isolated insult, some one-off ignorance, but it was only the beginning. Because Karen didn't just dislike the uniform, she disliked what it represented, and worse, she wanted it erased. But before I tell you what happened on that day, let me explain how it all began. When I first moved to Oak Glen, I thought I'd found the perfect place to disappear quietly. After 3 decades in the Army, multiple deployments in one bad year that ended with a titanium rod in my right leg, all I wanted was peace. No sirens, no yelling, no command briefs or radio chatter. Just stillness. Oak Glen had that. It was tucked just beyond the city's edge, full of tidy cul-de-sacs, maple-lined sidewalks, and people who waved from their porches. My house sat on a modest corner lot directly across from the community clubhouse. The front lawn sloped gently down toward the street, where I'd sometimes sit on the porch in the early morning with black coffee and silence. No one knew my name yet, and I liked it that way. The house itself was nothing fancy, just clean, quiet, with strong bones and a back patio that caught the light. I spent my first 6 months repainting walls, planting rose bushes, and tending to the flagpole I'd bolted into the front lawn. That flag went up every morning at sunrise and down at dusk. Not because I was trying to make a point, but because that rhythm, that ritual still mattered to me. Neighbors were polite at first. Some waved. A couple introduced themselves with baked goods or lawn advice. One woman, Marla, left a note in my mailbox that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. My late husband served in Korea. Thank you for your service." But then came the summer barbecue. I hadn't planned to go, but I figured it might help to show up, say hello, and let folks know I wasn't some recluse. I wore jeans and a polo shirt, brought a tray of deviled eggs, and kept to myself. That's when Karen introduced herself. Blonde bob, tight smile, a clipboard even at a barbecue. She was the president of the HOA and introduced herself like a senator. "I'm Karen Dietrich. We're very community-oriented here, James. We like to keep things balanced." She said it like a warning. Still, I smiled and nodded, thanked her, and moved on. But I noticed her watching me the rest of the afternoon like I was a smudge she couldn't scrub off the guest list. After that, things were quiet. I got involved in a few community initiatives, helped patch some fences after a storm, installed a bench near the walking path with HOA approval. People seemed to appreciate the effort. I even got invited to join the social committee. That fall, I helped set up the Veterans Day brunch at the clubhouse. Nothing flashy, just coffee, some framed photos of local vets, and a few folding chairs. I wore my service cap and a blazer, nothing formal. Karen didn't attend, but I heard from someone that she didn't believe in glorifying military violence. I let it go. I'd seen plenty of that during my years overseas. I wasn't looking for a fight, just a little room to breathe. By spring, my roses bloomed. I replaced the wood on my porch swing. I even started writing again longhand in notebooks I'd kept since Iraq. Oak Glen was quiet, predictable, until that gala, until the uniform, until Karen made it very clear that who I was and what I stood for wasn't welcome in her version of community. She didn't just humiliate me that night. She drew a line in the sand, and I realized slowly, painfully, that if I didn't stand up, she'd make sure no one like me ever felt at home in that neighborhood again. After the gala incident, I gave it a few days. Maybe I hoped Karen would realize she'd gone too far. Maybe I was waiting for someone on the board to reach out to apologize, or even just to check on me. Nothing came. Instead, a letter showed up in my mailbox. It was printed on official HOA letterhead and sealed in one of those overly formal envelopes like the kind used for jury duty or parking violations. The language was sterile, lawyer-tested. This is to inform you that the Homeowners Association will be implementing a revised dress code policy for all community events, effective immediately. The kicker came in the last paragraph. Attendees are asked to refrain from wearing military uniforms, fatigues, or insignia at all community-sanctioned gatherings, as such attire may create an environment of intimidation or discomfort. I read that sentence twice, then once more slowly to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Intimidation, discomfort. I'd spent 3 decades defending people like Karen. I'd stood guard outside schools in Kabul. I'd held the hand of a dying private who was younger than Karen's favorite Chardonnay. And now I was being told that my uniform, the same one that draped the coffins of fallen friends, wasn't appropriate for her wine and cheese meetups. I took the letter and folded it neatly, slid it into the same box where I kept my discharge papers, my medals, and my father's flag from Vietnam. It didn't belong anywhere near the kitchen table. The next community event was a spring potluck at the clubhouse. I didn't go. Neither did a few other neighbors, Marla included. She stopped by my porch the next day with a pie and a sigh. You know, she said my Ernie wore his uniform to every 4th of July until the day he couldn't anymore. He would have called her something unprintable. I chuckled. He'd be right. But the chuckle faded fast, because Karen wasn't finished. A week later, the minutes from the last HOA meeting were posted online. In them, Karen had proposed new guidelines for decorum, including limitations on yard displays, flags, statues, memorials. I knew who she was aiming at, and she wasn't subtle. The policy suggested that front yard elements promoting any single ideology be subject to board approval. My flagpole, the one I'd installed myself with concrete footing and steel brackets, suddenly required a height adjustment and aesthetic review. 2 days after that, a violation notice showed up. Flagpole exceeds community height standards. Must be removed or modified within 14 days to avoid penalty. That flag had flown outside my base in Kandahar. I'd brought it home as a quiet tribute. I didn't fly it out of pride. I flew it for memory, for meaning. But Karen didn't care about any of that. She saw it as defiance. And worse, she was getting the board to back her up. I appealed the notice citing HOA policy. The rulebook was vague and never enforced on other homes. The board dismissed my appeal within 48 hours. That night, I took the flag down before sunset for the first time since moving in. Not because I accepted defeat, but because I refused to give Karen the satisfaction of fining me over something sacred. Still, it hurt, more than I'd expected. I felt it in my chest the way I used to feel the ache of a lost comrade. It was slow, heavy, and lodged somewhere behind my ribs. Something had shifted in the neighborhood. I saw it in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way conversations died when I stepped onto the path. I was being painted as the problem, as the aggressor. I had always believed my service spoke for itself, that I didn't need to explain or justify what the uniform meant. But Karen had flipped the script. She'd turned something honorable into something threatening. And the worst part was she was getting away with it, until I decided she wouldn't. It's one thing to be disrespected by a stranger. It's another to feel erased by your own community. I used to wake up early, take my coffee out to the front porch, and listen to the birds before the sprinklers kicked on. It had been my favorite part of the day. But after Karen's campaign, the porch felt different, smaller, exposed, like I was on display for a jury that had already voted me out. The social committee quietly reorganized. I wasn't invited back. My emails about planning the Memorial Day breakfast went unanswered. Someone even moved the framed photo of local veterans, including mine, off the clubhouse wall. It was replaced with a generic landscape painting that looked like it belonged in a dentist's office. When I asked about it, Karen told me it had been a curation update, said it was nothing personal, but the edges of her voice were sharp. Marla, bless her, tried to keep me involved. She'd drop by with newsletters, urge me to show up at meetings, remind me that I had every right to be there. But I knew what she didn't want to say out loud. Karen had poisoned the well. The people who once smiled now nodded with tight lips. Some turned away entirely. A few new neighbors crossed the street when they saw me walking. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough. One afternoon, I found a sticky note on my truck windshield. Just 3 words scrawled in shaky ink: wrong neighborhood soldier. I stared at it for a long time, long enough for the sun to heat the glass beneath my hand. Then I folded it and placed it under my windshield wiper, a reminder, not of hate, but of clarity. This wasn't about me being too loud, too proud, or too difficult. It was about control. Karen didn't just dislike the military, she disliked anything that challenged her image of Oak Glen as a curated, conflict-free bubble. And I was a walking contradiction to that fantasy. But she didn't realize something important. My years in service had taught me patience, discipline, and how to endure isolation without losing myself. Karen thought she could freeze me out. She thought social pressure would make me tuck tail and leave. Instead, it made me focus. And the thing that sharpened everything, the true turning point, came on a Wednesday morning when a letter from the HOA appeared taped to my door, not mailed, taped. It cited ongoing non-compliance related to my aesthetic violations. This time they took issue with the small commemorative bench I'd placed under my front maple tree. A simple wooden bench. I'd stenciled 3 initials into the backrest RMW, the name of my best friend who never made it back from Fallujah. Karen claimed the bench qualified as an unapproved memorial structure and gave me 10 days to remove it. That's when something in me broke. I sat on that bench for over an hour, just staring at the house across the street, the one where Karen lived 2 stories of beige conformity. Her manicured hedges were shaped like chess pieces. Her lawn had artificial turf imported from Nevada. Nothing about it was alive. Nothing about it was real. And yet somehow I was the problem. That evening, I walked into my office, pulled out a file I hadn't opened in years, and flipped through the tabs until I found the one labeled land parcels. It was something I'd looked into when I first moved in, a curiosity, really. I'd noticed a small plot of land that bordered the edge of the clubhouse parking lot. It was overgrown and ignored. Technically not part of the HOA's domain, privately owned, zoned for community development or single-use business. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, I made a call to an old friend, Amanda Lowry. She'd served in JAG and now practiced real estate law in the city. We'd gone through officer school together. She owed me a favor, or 3. James, she said, when I told her what I had in mind, I've waited years for you to ask me something like this. I laughed. It's not about revenge. She paused. Then make sure what you build hurts just the right people. I hung up with a new fire in my chest. It wasn't about getting even. It was about reclaiming the space Karen tried to take from me. And more than that, it was about creating something that made sure no one else would have to swallow the silence I'd lived with for months. That overgrown lot, it wasn't much, but it was enough. The day I signed the purchase agreement for the lot next to the clubhouse, it felt like flipping a switch. Inside me, the first real power I'd felt since Karen started her crusade. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had tried so hard to erase any trace of my service from the neighborhood. And now I owned the patch of land her precious clubhouse looked out on. It wasn't a flashy purchase. The lot had sat untouched for years, used mostly by kids cutting through to the walking trail. Weeds had claimed most of it, and a rusty chain-link fence bordered one side. But I didn't see the brush or the dirt. I saw possibility. Amanda helped me close the sale quickly. The property had originally been zoned for a small retail build-out, a coffee shop maybe, or a salon. But the zoning also allowed for community-serving facilities provided the proper paperwork and city review were completed. That's where the plan started to form, not as a reaction, but as a mission. I wasn't just going to fight Karen, I was going to outbuild her. I applied for 501c3 status within 2 weeks. Valor House, that's what I called it. A modest multi-use community space for local veterans. Workshops, peer counseling, a shared garden. A quiet place for people to gather and breathe away from the noise and rules of HOA politics. Karen didn't know about any of it, not yet. Construction plans take time and I had to move carefully. I kept my permits off the public radar until they were approved. Amanda walked me through loopholes and filings. My contractor was another old friend, Pete, former Navy CB, who could get a steel beam upright in a windstorm and build a foundation like he was still under fire. We worked fast, quietly. Pete's crew used unmarked trucks, no signs, no chatter. But word started to spread anyway. One morning I was outside reviewing blueprints when Karen strolled across the street, her face pinched like she'd smelled something sour. Morning, she said tightly, I noticed a lot of activity over there. You planning a renovation project? I smiled, offered her a bottle of water. Just some improvements to my property. Her eyes narrowed. You know the HOA guidelines require approval for any changes that affect the community view. I nodded toward the lot. This isn't HOA land. That threw her. She blinked. Still, I'd hope you'd be transparent. After all, we live in a community. I let the silence stretch. Then I said exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. She left after that, but I could feel her watching from her upstairs window for days. Then came the letters. Karen petitioned the city zoning board to pause any construction adjacent to the clubhouse, citing possible environmental risks. She requested a neighborhood review. Amanda, being Amanda, had already handled the legal end. Our permits were airtight. Her challenge went nowhere. When Karen realized the lot was now a registered nonprofit and that I was operating within full legal bounds, she ramped up the passive aggression. HOA emails warning of unsanctioned gatherings, flyers mysteriously removed from mailboxes, rumors that I was politicizing the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the foundation was poured. Walls went up. The frame took shape. And I wasn't alone. Veterans I hadn't seen in years showed up to help. A Marine named Cedric brought tools and his teenage son. A retired Air Force nurse donated chairs and supplies. One guy, Miguel, brought homemade tamales and stayed for hours just sweeping the sidewalk. And the best part, neighbors noticed. Not just the veterans, the people Karen never counted on, the single moms, the elderly couple down the street, the high schooler with a woodworking hobby. They started asking questions. Can anyone volunteer? What are you building over there? Do you need help with the garden? I kept the answer simple. Just a place for people to come and feel useful again. Karen couldn't stop it no matter how many memos she sent. One day I caught her staring from across the street as we hoisted a flagpole a little shorter than the one she'd had removed from my yard but taller in presence. Pete saluted as we raised the stars and stripes. I didn't. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, watching the flag ripple against the sky. Karen didn't say a word. She turned and walked inside. That evening, I got an email from the city. Our application for a grand opening permit had been approved. Street closure, noise allowance, even vendor licenses. Amanda had worked her magic. The date was set, June 14th, Flag Day. Flag Day arrived like it was waiting for this moment. I woke up before dawn and stepped onto the porch with a mug of black coffee. The street was still, the sky still holding on to its last bit of night. Across the way, the clubhouse sat quiet and hollow, as if it already knew what was coming. Valor House stood proudly now. The final coat of paint had dried 2 days ago, a deep slate blue with white trim. The front steps were wide and low-built for wheelchairs and aging knees. A long planter box stretched across the walkway, already blooming with roses. Marla donated them. She said Karen hates roses, which is exactly why you need more of them. By 9:00 a.m., the street began to stir. Volunteers in matching shirts parked along the curb, unpacking folding chairs, stacking banners, laying out welcome tables. Local ROTC students trickled in with their instructors. There was even a color guard scheduled to perform the presentation of arms. And the best part? The press van. It pulled up just after 10 Channel 7 News, followed closely by a reporter from the city's main paper. Amanda had sent out the press releases weeks ago. She had a knack for timing. Karen came outside around 10:15. She wasn't dressed in her usual tan slacks and tight smile. No, today she wore full pearls and a linen blazer like she was going to brunch with the governor. She watched everything with the stiff poise of someone trying not to scream. At 10:30, people really began arriving. Cars lined both sides of the street. Neighbors I hadn't seen in months walked up, some with folding chairs, others with plates of cookies or lemonade pitchers. A group of veterans from the nearby city center arrived in uniform. Real ones. Rows of medals pressed blue's solemn expressions. I stood by the front steps and greeted each one with a handshake. Then right on cue, a black SUV pulled into the cul-de-sac. A man in a suit stepped out, followed by a woman with a clipboard. It was Representative Davis, a state official who served 2 terms in the Army before his time in office. Amanda had invited him personally. Karen's face lost its color when she saw him. He made a short speech at the podium we'd placed beneath the flag. He talked about the dignity of service, about reintegration, about the power of community when it's rooted in respect. He didn't mention Karen. He didn't have to. The crowd clapped. Neighbors cried. The camera crew captured every moment. Then came the ribbon cutting. Pete handed me a pair of giant ceremonial scissors, red-handled plastic straight out of a party store. I raised them and turned slightly to catch Karen in my periphery. She was standing just outside the clubhouse's front doors, arms folded, lips pressed into a line. I didn't smile, I just cut. The ribbon fluttered to the ground and, with it, something inside me released. The weight I'd been carrying, months of isolation, humiliation, anger lifted. Not all at once, but enough to breathe. After the ceremony, the doors opened and guests flowed inside. The lobby was clean and bright with photographs on the walls, not just of war, but of healing. Veterans in gardens, story circles, service dogs, smiles. One corner held the bench from my front yard fully restored. The initials RMW had been carved deeper, surrounded by a new plaque for those who served and those who never stopped. Around noon, Karen approached me. She didn't smile. She didn't congratulate. She said, "I didn't think you'd take it this far." I looked at her not with anger, but with the steady calm I'd learned to master when chaos threatened to rise. "You tried to make me invisible," I said. "So I built something no one can ignore." She scoffed. "This is a political statement." I nodded. "So was your dress code." Then I turned and walked away. I had people to greet, stories to hear, a space to protect. That afternoon, Channel 7 ran a segment titled From Uniform to Unity, One Man's Mission to Honor Veterans in the Heart of the Suburbs. My inbox filled with messages, former soldiers, grateful families, teachers asking about field trips, a woman offering to donate art supplies for the healing workshops. Karen had lost, not in court, not in some petty shouting match, but where it mattered most, in the heart of the community. She would walk by Valor House every day now, park next to it during board meetings, glance at the roses and the flagpole and the people walking in and out with purpose. Her clubhouse had a view now, and it was mine. The weeks after the grand opening felt like standing in the sun after a long winter. People came, every day more than I expected. Some stopped by just to see what it was. Some stayed. They talked, listened, brought food, helped fix shelves. There was a rhythm forming, not just activity, but healing. The kind of quiet camaraderie I remembered from deployment, but with less weight, less fear. A shared purpose without the threat of loss. I didn't speak much at first. I let the space speak for itself. Valor House had a donated library wall with worn military memoirs, journals, and poetry collections. A kitchen that could serve meals for small groups. A converted back room for art therapy. One vet started teaching watercolor classes on Tuesdays. Another ran a small group for PTSD. But perhaps the most visited room was the front lounge, quiet chairs, sunlight pouring through the windows, and that bench, the one Karen tried to erase, positioned near the entrance. It became a small ritual. Every vet who came through would sit there for a moment, nod once, and move on. No words needed. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't done. She called an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss disruptions to neighborhood integrity. I attended quietly, sitting in the back. She didn't acknowledge me. Instead, she launched into a rehearsed speech. There have been numerous complaints, she said, about increased traffic noise and the disruptive presence of strangers entering our neighborhood. Her voice was calm, but her eyes flicked to me. The irony burned. Veterans, seniors, volunteers, these were the strangers she meant. A few residents shifted uncomfortably. One woman, Sarah, a mom of two who'd once avoided me after the flag incident, stood up. "My kids go there every Wednesday to help with the garden," she said, "and I've never felt safer in this neighborhood." The room went quiet. Then Marla raised her hand. "Karen, what happened to you was a bad look. But trying to shut this place down just makes you smaller." I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The vote was called to file a community nuisance complaint against Valor House. It failed, 4-1. Karen's face flushed. She stood abruptly, muttering something about long-term implications, and stormed out of her own meeting. A few weeks later, another letter arrived at my door. This one from the city's Community Leadership Office. They wanted to nominate Valor House for the annual Civic Impact Award. Amanda called me that night. "You know, this means she has to publicly acknowledge it now, right?" she said, half laughing. I didn't laugh. I just stared at the letter, then glanced out the window. Across the street, Karen's porch light flicked on. She stood there watering plants that had never quite bloomed right since last year's drought. The clubhouse behind her looked dull, outdated, a relic trying to compete with something living and breathing. There was one more thing to do. I asked the board of Valor House to approve a small addition, a bronze monument just outside the main entrance facing the clubhouse. Nothing grand, just a 3-foot-high stone with a plaque. The inscription read, "To all who served and to those who stood by them, respect is the highest rank." We unveiled it quietly with no press, just a small gathering. Karen passed by during the ceremony. She didn't stop, but her steps slowed. A month later, I saw her parked by the clubhouse as usual. Except this time when she stepped out, she looked at the monument, just for a second, and then walked away. That was all I needed, because some legacies aren't loud. Some stand still and let others come to them. Summer rolled in with the kind of heat that melted time, the kind where the afternoon stretched and slowed, and neighbors lingered longer in conversation. Valor House had become more than I expected and more than Karen feared. We hosted our first Veterans Family Day in July. Kids chalked the sidewalk with red, white, and blue drawings. A local barbecue joint donated food. Cedric brought his old Army buddies and set up a makeshift karaoke station on the back patio. One of the teens who volunteered at our garden asked if she could sing. She covered America the Beautiful, and there wasn't a dry eye on the lawn. Karen, of course, was not invited, but she came anyway. I was near the grill flipping burgers when I saw her standing on the sidewalk across the street, arms crossed, sunglasses low on her nose. She wore that same linen blazer as if trying to remind everyone that she still held some invisible title. I walked over. "Would you like a plate?" I asked. "Pulled pork's pretty solid today." Her mouth tightened. "This isn't a sanctioned gathering." "Good thing we're not on HOA property," I said, handing a paper plate to a passing kid. "Or someone might write a memo." She didn't laugh, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she stood there alone while the neighborhood buzzed with warmth and life behind me. I saw it in her posture, the way she glanced at the people she once commanded with rules and warnings. They weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking past her. Then came the speech. Representative Davis had returned this time not just as a guest, but as an award presenter. Valor House had officially won the Civic Impact Award. He called it a cornerstone of dignity in a time that needed it most. As he read the award citation, the applause was thunderous. Pete stood next to me, arms crossed like a proud builder. Amanda wiped her eyes behind her sunglasses. Marla clapped so hard I thought she'd break her wrists. I stepped up to the mic, not to gloat, just to say thank you. But I couldn't resist one small twist of the knife. "I built this place," I said slowly, "because someone once told me my uniform didn't belong here, that it made people uncomfortable." I let the silence hang. But I don't believe in comfort over truth. I believe in community over conformity. And I believe that honoring people's stories, even the messy, painful ones, makes a place stronger, not weaker. Karen turned and walked away. Halfway through my speech, no less. It was a beautiful little moment of petty justice. Not loud, not cruel, just real. A few days later, something interesting happened. The HOA newsletter, Karen's favorite outlet, included a half-paragraph blurb. "We congratulate our neighbor James Walker and Valor House on their recognition by the City Council. We look forward to continued collaboration on community initiatives." I read it 3 times, not because it was kind, it wasn't, it was diplomatic, but because it was concession. The woman who once told me I was militarizing the environment now had to publicly acknowledge the very space she tried to bury. Meanwhile, our Tuesday night sessions had grown so large, we had to move them to the back lawn. Teens sat next to veterans, sketching memories or listening to stories. A Gold Star mother donated a series of quilts to hang in the entryway. Even the clubhouse across the street started to feel different, emptier, like it had become the background to something more alive. Karen never approached me again. But every week her car was there, parked neatly in her spot. And every week she had to walk past that bronze plaque. Sometimes she glanced at it. Once she paused, but she never looked me in the eye. She didn't need to, because the whole neighborhood already had. Fall settled in, and with it came a sense of permanence. The leaves turned gold and fire orange, and Valor House stood rooted in the rhythm of the community. What had once been Karen's pristine little fiefdom was now a landscape marked by change, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. But as with all power lost, Karen didn't go quietly. In October, an anonymous complaint was filed with the city zoning office, alleging that Valor House was exceeding its permitted use. It claimed we were operating as a residential rehabilitation center, which was false, and it carried heavy implications. The city sent an inspector. He arrived with a clipboard and cautious politeness, clearly uncomfortable. I gave him a tour, showed him the permits, introduced him to the day's volunteers, a group of senior citizens organizing care packages for deployed troops. He didn't stay long. The next day we received notice, complaint dismissed. No action necessary. Amanda called that night laughing. She's panicking, throwing darts in the dark. You've built something too big for her to control and she can't stand it. It should have felt like closure, but I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted clarity. That weekend, I got it. One of the HOA board members, a guy named Patrick, who'd always been quiet in the meetings, invited me to grab coffee. He looked nervous, said he wanted to talk off the record. We met at a diner outside the neighborhood. Halfway through his eggs and toast, he leaned in. She tried to dig up dirt on you, he said, asked if anyone had access to your discharge records, wondered if maybe there was something she could use to file a complaint with the board. I set down my fork. He looked embarrassed. I didn't give her anything, but I think you should know. I thanked him, shook his hand, and drove home in silence. That night, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were copies of my DD-214, my commendations letters of service. My record was clean, flawless even. But the idea that someone in my own neighborhood would try to weaponize it, not out of principle, but out of spite, that stuck with me. Karen wasn't just a bully. She was an architect of erasure. She wanted to rewrite the story of our street, scrub it clean of anything that reminded her of complexity, of contradiction, of courage. But here's the thing about stories. They don't disappear. They're remembered. They're retold. And sometimes they're etched in bronze. The next HOA election came in November. Karen ran unopposed for years. Not this time. 3 new candidates emerged, 2 moms and 1 former Air Force mechanic named Hank. People had seen enough. The election turnout was the highest in Oak Glen's history. Karen lost. By a landslide. She didn't show up to the vote count. But she posted a message in the HOA newsletter the following week announcing her resignation and wishing the community continued growth and harmony. It was the quietest she'd ever been, and yet it was the loudest victory I'd ever felt. The day after her resignation, I found a folded note left at the Valor House front door. No signature, just neat handwriting. I didn't understand what you were doing. I do now. I was wrong. Thank you. I never found out who wrote it, but I didn't need to. Some fights don't end with shouting. Some don't end at all. They just fade like morning fog burning off under a rising sun. Karen didn't pack up and move away. She stayed, shrunk back into the shadows. The woman who once tried to dictate every detail of community life now walked her dog without speaking. No more memos, no more flyers, just footsteps on pavement. And each time she passed Valor House, she saw the world that moved on without her. Peace doesn't always come like a thunderclap. Sometimes it arrives slowly in the way a door stays open just a little longer, or how the silence around you stops feeling heavy. After Karen's resignation, Oak Glen began to breathe differently. There were fewer rules, fewer cold stares, more porch lights on in the evenings, more kids playing past curfew. The HOA meetings became less about violations and more about ideas, real ones. People laughed, disagreed even. But it felt like conversation again, not judgment. Valor House kept growing, not in size but in presence. It had become a place where people simply showed up, not because they had to, because they wanted to, because they felt seen. Every week, new faces walked through our doors. A retired Marine who'd stopped talking to his family finally brought his granddaughter to our woodworking class. A woman who lost her brother in Afghanistan sat down with Marla in the rose garden and just cried. No words, just held her hand. That was enough. Some mornings I'd sit on the back steps with Pete. We wouldn't talk much, just sip our coffee and watch the sun catch the tips of the grass. The silence between us was comfortable, full. One afternoon, a local high school asked if their civics class could come tour the center. I agreed, and when the kids arrived, I gave them a gentle tour, nothing dramatic, just a quiet walk through stories they hadn't lived. They stood before the monument and read the inscription. I watched one boy frown, reread it, then ask, did someone actually try to stop this from being built? I smiled, not anymore. The question stayed with me, though, because it reminded me that we often think injustice is loud, obvious, flashing red signs, but sometimes it's small, civil, disguised in good manners and tidy lawns. It sneaks up, rewrites norms, tells us to sit down in the name of order. And the only way to beat it is to build louder than it breaks. One evening, just before the holidays, I found myself walking past Karen's house. I hadn't done that in a while. Her porch lights were off, no decorations, just quiet. But something was different. A small wreath hung on her door, a red, white, and blue ribbon wrapped around its base. I stopped, just for a second. I didn't feel anger or victory, just distance, the kind that comes when your path moves forward and someone else's doesn't. When I got back to Valor House, the rooms were still buzzing. A local jazz trio was playing in the lounge. Laughter floated down the hall. Someone had baked cookies and left them on the front desk with a note, "To the place that helped me feel whole again." I sat in the lobby and watched the scene unfold. People passing coffee, a kid reading quietly by the window, a vet in his 70s teaching a teen how to tie a proper necktie. No one knew I was watching, and that was the best part. Because this space, this rhythm, no longer needed me to hold it up. It was standing on its own. I had reclaimed more than my dignity. I had reclaimed my place, not just in Oak Glen, but in the story of what a neighborhood can be when fear loses and community wins. Legacy doesn't always look like a statue or a newspaper headline. Sometimes it's a quiet corner in a building, a name engraved on a bench, a moment someone remembers because it helped them breathe again. A year after the grand opening of Valor House, we held a small ceremony. No politicians, no cameras, just the people who made it what it was. Pete grilled burgers out back, Marla brought lemonade. Amanda showed up in her usual blazer, but this time with paint under her nails. She'd been helping with our new mural. The mural stretched along the back garden wall. Painted by veterans and teenagers together, it told a story not in words, but in images, boots in the sand, hands gripping letters, a flag half folded, and at the center a blooming rose rooted deep into the earth. Beneath it in soft lettering, "From silent strength." That phrase had come from a journal entry one of our visitors had left behind. A woman who never gave her name, but came every Thursday to sit near the roses. We never asked her to explain. No one had to. That was the legacy of Valor House. It became a sanctuary for people who didn't know they needed one. Veterans who hadn't spoken in years found themselves leading workshops. Teenagers who had never met a service member wrote essays about sacrifice. Families who once looked at uniforms with suspicion now dropped off cookies and blankets just in case someone needs one. We started a scholarship fund in honor of Miguel, the man who swept the sidewalks and fed us his famous tamales. He passed quietly in his sleep one winter night, but not before donating half his retirement savings to help fund mentorship programs. His name was etched into a stone outside the garden. Karen, as far as I know, still lives across the street. She rarely speaks to anyone. She no longer attends HOA meetings. The clubhouse stands as it always did, but with fewer people walking through its doors, the paint has started to chip. And yet every day she has to see us, not as a confrontation, but as a continuation. She parks beside the monument. Her headlights sometimes hit the bronze just right, casting a glow over the words, "Respect is the highest rank." And I like to think in some small unspoken way she reads them now with less resistance. The greatest revenge I ever had wasn't in shaming her. It was in refusing to shrink, in building something that grew bigger than her voice. I don't need the last word. The building speaks for itself. And long after I'm gone, long after the roses bloom and wither and bloom again, Valor House will still be there. A house of memory, a house of peace, a house that rose from a battle no one saw coming and became the very thing that makes the neighborhood whole. Looking back now, I realize Karen never stood a chance, not against me personally, but against what I represented. She tried to push out a symbol, not understanding that symbols, when backed by real people and real stories, don't disappear. They multiply. For a long time, I thought silence was the price of peace. That if I just kept my head down, didn't ruffle feathers, the neighborhood would accept me. But silence wasn't peace, it was surrender. And I hadn't spent 3 decades in uniform just to surrender to a clipboard and a closed mind. Valor House was never built to prove her wrong. It was built because the people she tried to silence needed a place to be right. It became more than a rebuttal. It became a home. That's the thing about community, real community. It's not something you enforce with rules or designed by committee. It's something you build with patience, resilience, and an open door. And as it turns out, that open door led to something lasting. The roses outside Valor House still bloom every spring. They don't ask for permission. They don't follow guidelines. They just grow. Wild, beautiful, defiant. People still gather on the porch. The bench still holds stories. Sometimes I sit there and listen. Not to the words, but to the laughter. The soft sounds of healing. The weightlessness that comes after standing your ground and knowing you did it with grace. I used to think my legacy would be written in a service record or a folded flag. Turns out, it's written in chalk drawings, garden soil, and the eyes of a teenager learning how to salute. So if you've ever been told you don't belong, if someone like Karen has tried to make you small, remember this. You don't need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you just build something that outshines the flame. And when you do, you don't just win. You endure. It started with a dog. Or rather, the complaint about a dog. Mrs. Lefferts lived 2 houses down from me. Widowed, 83. She walked her beagle Oliver twice a day. Slow steps, soft voice. Sometimes she stopped to chat if I was on the porch. Always wore the same lavender sun hat. Oliver was the only companion she had left as far as I could tell. He wore a red bandana and had one droopy eye that gave him a look of eternal worry. One morning in early spring, I saw her sitting on the curb, shoulders hunched forward. Oliver pressed to her side like he was trying to hold her together. I walked over and asked what was wrong. She didn't answer right away, just handed me a folded letter. The HOA had issued her a warning, formal uppercase in cold. Excessive pet noise. Violation of Community Standard 3.3. She had 15 days to address the problem before a fine would be levied. The letter listed 3 complaints. Anonymous, described continuous barking at inappropriate hours. Now I had seen Oliver bark. Twice. Once when a squirrel got too bold, once when a delivery truck backfired. But continuous inappropriate hours, the dog barely made a sound, and I lived closer to her house than anyone. I looked at her, saw the way her hands trembled as she smoothed the paper. "I think someone wants me out," she whispered. I heard them talking at the mailbox, about making room for younger buyers. My stomach turned. This was no random enforcement. This was a campaign. A quiet one, a familiar one. Karen might have stepped down, but the system she left behind still had fangs. Her former vice president, Marlene Pratt, had taken over a woman with a clipped voice and ironed hair, who never looked you in the eye unless she was trying to find fault. She had inherited Karen's philosophy: control what you can, remove what you cannot. I told Mrs. Lefferts I'd take care of it. She patted my hand, tried to smile, and shuffled back home with Oliver in tow. I started by requesting the complaint records. The HOA bylaws allowed any resident to see redacted violations upon written request. Marlene stalled, claimed they were confidential. I pushed. Amanda helped draft a formal letter citing civil code. 48 hours later, the records appeared in my inbox. The complaints came from 3 different addresses. One belonged to Marlene herself, the other 2 board members. It was coordinated, designed to make it seem legitimate, but it wasn't. It was a pressure tactic to drive out someone they deemed unnecessary. I printed everything and walked it over to Mrs. Lefferts. She sat at her kitchen table, sugar cubes stacked neatly beside her tea. She read the papers slowly, glasses slipping down her nose. When she finished, she didn't look angry. She looked tired. "I just want to live here in peace," she said. "Is that too much?" I told her no, and I meant it. The next day, I invited a few neighbors over. Not many, just the ones I trusted. People who had kids, dogs, lives that made noise. We talked, and then we organized. Over the course of 1 week, I collected audio recordings from 6 houses, all within 100 feet of Mrs. Lefferts. The result: not a single instance of Oliver barking for more than a few seconds. No patterns, no evidence. We compiled it into a neat little folder. Amanda helped me write a report. At the next HOA meeting, I stood and presented it. Marlene looked like she swallowed a lemon. "This is hearsay," she said. "No," I replied. "This is data. You claimed Oliver was disturbing the peace. I just proved he wasn't." She tried to pivot, claiming that it was about the potential for disruption, that dogs created wear and tear on common spaces, that the board had a responsibility to be proactive. I stepped forward and placed a copy of the complaint record on the table. "Then why are all the complaints coming from board members?" Silence. A few people murmured. Then Sarah, the same mom who once sided with Karen, but had since become one of Valor House's most committed volunteers, raised her hand. "Oliver plays with my kids," she said. "We've never had an issue. Maybe instead of pushing out our neighbors, we could focus on actually making this place better." That was the moment it shifted. The room wasn't hostile. It was embarrassed. Marlene sputtered through the rest of the meeting. No motion was made against Mrs. Lefferts. No fine, no further discussion. But I didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, we held the first neighborhood dog parade. A small, ridiculous, completely informal event. We made paper ribbons and handed out free treats. Oliver wore a miniature tuxedo vest. The kids loved it. Even some board members showed up, sheepish but smiling. Marlene did not. Mrs. Lefferts sat beside me on the Valor House lawn, Oliver panting gently at her feet. She watched the crowd with a quiet kind of wonder. "I thought I was alone," she said. I shook my head. "Not anymore." Sometimes the battle isn't loud. It doesn't come with shouting or lawsuits. Sometimes it's just an old woman and a beagle being told they don't belong. And sometimes justice looks like a parade of dogs in silly costumes reclaiming a street from silence. That's the thing about dignity. Once you defend it, even just once, it tends to hold the line on its own.